Welcome to Learn It from a Layman. This is Cameron talking today instead of Carl because he
I sound like that.
Yep, I was going to say Guanjo, which is a nice made-up virus, just like other made-up viruses.
We've gone off the rails so incredibly quickly, and now the audience understands why I do the intros.
I'm just joking. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about what are we talking about? We're talking about all sorts of fun things and biology.
Basics of biology.
We're talking about the basics of biology. I actually know something about biology. Once in a while, I think I paid attention in class. We're joined here by our instructor, Johnny the Awesome Nielsen. And, of course, as always, our favorite person ever, Timothy Cox.
Wait, when did we start being nice to Tim?
Yeah, I was going to say that's inappropriate and uncalled for.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
it's all right. It took me a while.
I tripped you up. Okay.
All right, I'm going to
Tim is as thick as a cell wall of a plant cell.
All right, I got.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm actually flattered.
Cellulose style.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Cameron. I'm not going to talk much, but I do have one or two questions to seed the conversation with, and then I'll pipe down. So first of all, biology, my understanding is the chemistry of living things, essentially, plus some other stuff. But what I wanted to focus on first was the chemistry, the idea of organic compounds. So, Johnny, what is an organic compound?
Yeah, so one thing that you have to understand about biology, like before we get started in things, is that all sciences interact with each other and use mechanisms from each other to help make sense. So the better you understand chemistry, the better you understand biology. The better you understand physics, the better you understand biology. So everything kind of goes back to all these sciences interacting. We like to pretend that they're different, but the more you understand each of them, the better it makes sense. So that's why chemistry is, our first topic when we're talking about biology, I guess, is
exactly.
It's you have to start with some type of molecule. Okay, so some type of and I've just used all the scientific words for so many years that it's really hard to try to.
It's a layman podcast.
In layman terms.
Yeah.
So you have these bits of things that interact with each other. So an organic compound is basically just made up of the element carbon, mainly a carbon backbone with other side groups. So this is, I'm not explaining this well.
No, that's good. No, so carbon being incredibly crucial. I think we'll eventually do a podcast about the basics of chemistry, but like you said, they kind of all interact a bit. So why does carbon, what makes that unique? I guess this take us back to like the beginning of life. So we talk about amino acids. Are those organic compounds?
Yeah. So, when we talk about biological molecules, you're talking about, amino acids, you're talking about nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA, which everybody kind of has heard of. You're talking about like sugars, which are also called carbohydrates, and lipids or fats. All of these are made up of mainly the element carbon. So carbon is a very stable compound and found in great abundance in our world. So it's something that is very, because it's so stable, it's able to take a lot of unique characteristics and bind to a variety of different types of groups to help make other stable compounds that can interact with each other.
I've heard a lot of talk about amino acids. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, I was just gonna ask for a bit of clarification on stable. By stable, do you mean unreactive? Like it's not gonna,
it's not gonna explode.
Okay.
But they do have small reactions between things, and that's how that's how everything works, is with chemical reactions, chemical interactions. And actually then we start getting into physics and physics interactions between molecules and things like that. So carbon just allows a really good, I guess you could say that carbon is the skeleton that can hold the parts that are reactive and help it be more controlled. Does that probably makes maybe a little more sense?
Oh yeah, I think so. And this is why we say a carbon-based life form, like, because are you saying everything's made of carbon? So when we talk about life,
so that's kind of an oxymoron, because all living things are made out of a carbon backbone, I guess.
or kind of redundant. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean that's what people say. And so yeah, carbon is going to make up the most the majority of the weight and substance of any thing that is alive, that we consider alive: plants, animals, bacteria, anything like that.
Okay, so I've heard a lot about amino acids in relation to, well, food, but also the beginning of life. So what is an amino acid?
Yeah, so amino actually is just referring to the structure of what it looks like when you're thinking about the chemistry of it. So amino is a nitrogen group. So an amino acid has a nitrogen group on it, and that's all that means. It's a carbon backbone with an amino group. So, and then it also has on the other side an acid group, and we don't really need to get into all the details of what kind of acid, but that's why it's called an amino acid, because it has those two groups on it, which allow them to link together very easily. The nitrogen group can interact with the acid group, which is what the way the electrons interact with each other. It allows them to make a bond and bind together. And when you get a whole bunch of them that bind together, that's how you make proteins. Proteins are probably the most important, well, they are the most important thing for living creatures, because these are basically like machines, or a lot of proteins are machines, or structural elements, or anything like that. But basically, this is how your body is able to function. This is how your cells can talk to each other. This is how your brain can send signals. It's all done based on different types of proteins, which do different types of things. So amino acids are very, very important for life. That's why it's one of the main biological molecules that we talk about. And that's why it's so important.
Okay, so from these small, and you've mentioned a couple other ones, right? The nucleic acids and things like that. But eventually we get larger structures building together, right? And that's when we start forming some type of, I mean, what are the small, so we talk about cells, but smaller than cells, or the components of cells.
Exactly. So there you have a cell, and that's alive in your body. Your body's made of cells. And if you break the cell down into smaller pieces, the things inside the cells, those are organelles. And the organelles are made up of these biological macromolecules. So nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, which are fats, and carbohydrates. So the organelles are made up of a variety of these different types of things. And then when you break those down, proteins break down into amino acids. So amino acids make up proteins. And nucleic acids are already small, but they make up basically DNA and RNA. And then you can have small, like a single sugar molecule, or you can chain them all together. And actually, sugars all linked together in plants is something called cellulose, which makes trees. So it can get really strong. You can have these really strong bonds between things. And then you can also have, let's see, which one haven't I? Oh, lipids. So lipids or fats are very important for the interactions of your cells with the environment. So they can keep things out, and some things they let through freely, but it allows you to have, since you have a membrane made of lipids on your cells, it allows different reactions to be able to happen. It allows you to be able to send electrical signals through your nerves. It allows you to keep, the inside of the cell separate from the outside of the cell, which is, obviously very important for different functions of cells and things like that. And they can be very structurally interesting and different. I mean, if you look at like an immune cell, that looks a lot different than a neuron does, which is, a neuron's probably everyone's favorite type of cell because it looks really cool.
It's my favorite.
Yeah, everyone's like, oh, your brain, it's so cool. But there's other cells that do other things that are cool too. Don't just leave it all to the neurons. So anyway, all these things work together to make up the body and how it all functions together. But yeah, when you're talking about amino acids, that's not the same thing as a nucleic acid, and it's not the same thing as a lipid. So all those are different types of carbon-containing compounds with different types of groups on them, and that's why they're classified in the way that they are.
Okay. One of the things that you mentioned while you were, you said that lipid structures kind of keep things out or in appropriately. Are those related to osmosis at all? I remember learning about osmosis once upon a time, and it's a very important part of selling a water filtration system.
Yeah, exactly. So you have a membrane of the cell that is made up of lipids. They're called phospholipids because they have a phosphate group, which is chemistry, and a lipid, which is just a big long carbon chain that doesn't like water. So these carbon chains, they meet in the middle. So there's a region inside that repels the water, just like you don't mix oil and water, like it makes a layer. That's the same thing that your cell is doing, just on a much lower scale. You have this small membrane. This membrane can let some things through, and it won't let other things through. So the membrane doesn't actually let water through because you have a whole section right in the middle that repels water. So what your body does is it makes these big proteins that make a hole in the membrane that allow water through. They have water channels, so water can pass freely from one side to the other. Other things that are hydrophobic, or things that repel water, or like fat type molecules and things like that, they can pass freely through that membrane because they're also hydrophobic. So they'll also pass right through the membrane and have no issues. But there's some substances, and things that we can talk about, like electrolytes. Everybody's heard of electrolytes, and there's all these fancy sports drinks that say they replenish your electrolytes. And really what electrolytes are just salt compounds that are dissolved in liquid, almost always water. When we're talking about this kind of stuff, we're talking about water. And then there's different concentrations of these things on each side of the cell. That is done with special pumps that use energy to create these gradients. So one that's really important is called the sodium potassium pump, and it keeps the sodium high on the outside of the cell and low on the inside of the cell. And it keeps potassium high on the inside of the cell and low on the outside of the cell. And this is important for a variety of functions of the cell. And then when you have that gradient, you have a lot of sodiums on the outside and hardly any on the inside. So that makes sodium want to go into the cell because everything wants to get back to equilibrium. Everything wants to be in, even with each other on each side. So, the sodium's going to want to go through the cell. So you can use that just like you would use water, like a waterfall could spin. What are those things called? The water wheel or whatever.
Yeah,
anyway, you
sure.
guys know what I'm talking about. Anyway,
Mill.
What's that?
Yeah, like a mill. You're talking
Yeah,
about
like a water mill. Yeah. So you're using that energy, that buildup of the energy to run another machine, and your cells can do that. But
Johnny,
probably the most important thing that the sodium potassium does is important for cell communication with your neurons. So it allows actually a signal to be passed down the cell membrane, and it goes from your brain all the way down to your big toe, and you're able to move muscles and things like that, or feel sensations and all that kind of stuff, all because the cell membrane can use these potential energies from gradients that it's built up. So there's going back to the electrolytes. The electrolyte balances are very important in your body, and I don't really want to go too much into depth with it because it can get a little complicated. But yeah, the electrolytes are something that are kept out by the membrane to allow a variety of cell functions.
Is that why you drinking too much water?
Yeah. So one thing, water, when we talk about water balance, water is very important to life, and is, this is where everything is interacting is within water. And so you don't want too much water to get into your cell, otherwise it'll swell up like a balloon and pop. And you don't want too little either, because it'll shrink and shrivel and die. So you have, you have to keep a very special balance of water, and that's also done with the sodium balance, because salt will attract water. So if you have a lot of salt in one place that's dissolved in water, the water molecules, they like that. They tend to congregate around that salt, is one way to think about it. So these gradients can be formed that can move water from one place to another. And that's, when we're talking about osmosis and things like that, that's why, like, let's say you drink a whole bunch of water, you drink too much water, and you start to dilute your blood. So the cells are going to want to dilute themselves as well, because your blood is dilute. So the water surrounding the cell doesn't have enough salt. So you're going to want to dilute your cells, and so water is going to pass freely into your cells through these channels that we had talked about earlier, and it's actually going to make those cells swell up, and they can burst. Now, normally, like, if this happens in your foot, like maybe your foot gets swollen, or you have like some cell death and things like that. But where it really becomes a problem is in encased enclosures, like your brain is within the skull. Your skull doesn't stretch. So if your brain swells, then you can actually get what's called brain herniation, where the brain will get pushed out because it'll swell. It's enclosed, and it'll push out the only hole it can come out, which is, your spinal cord. And that is, that's not a good thing. We can just put it at that.
I could have guessed that one.
That sounds like it would hurt a little bit too.
Yes. Cameron, did you have a
I
question?
don't know if it would hurt or if at that point you're probably just not feeling anything.
That's a good point.
No, I was just gonna, just Johnny said it really well. I know too many technical terms, and Johnny said it better. I was just like, you have a hyper and hypotonic, but Johnny said it better. So
Well, that's what you get with a doctor that's also a pediatrician. Johnny practices making things small and easily consumable, right, Johnny?
Yeah, exactly. That's all I do. Especially for the teens.
The teens love when you talk down to them.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when I was a teenager and I thought I knew everything.
Yeah, isn't that funny how you grow up and you're like, you know what? I guess I don't. And I think part of what comes to, as you learn more, you realize the things that you don't know about that thing. Like the more you dive into something, the more you realize there's so many more things that you could actually learn about, which is like just crazy to think about.
It's like the impetus for learning it from a layman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're not going anywhere soon, guys. We're not going anywhere soon.
Tim, do you have something?
Yeah.
No, just laughing at our own humility.
Yes. Well, it's better than hubris. So,
okay.
Okay.
I like to think of our podcast as we get the people to stick their feet into the shallow end, so they can, want to get into that deeper stuff.
That's right.
I know. I feel like I'm not really doing, the whole of biology very much justice, and that I'm rambling a lot because it just all interacts so much with each other. And then, like, I majored in biology in college, and then I went to medical school where there's a lot of biology, and then I work as a doctor where you think about biology and how the body interacts with different things all the time. And so it becomes really complicated to try to explain, how it all works without using technical terms and without getting into too much detail, because, you'll start talking about one thing and you're like, oh, I haven't explained that other thing that makes it make more sense. So let me go to that thing. And you just end up getting lost in this big mess. It's like talking to those guys that know a lot about cars and you're like, well, how does an engine work? And then 45 minutes later, you're like, no, I don't get it. And then most people are like, well, you put gas in the car and it goes.
Yeah, that's what you got to know.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think I've learned most of what I need to about, medicine and medical things as well. I've watched House.
Yeah, that's very accurate.
I'm sure 100%, right? I mean, I've seen some other medical dramas, so I'm pretty sure I can treat lots of bad acting. Okay, before we
My
move
favorite
on,
thing is to watch House, and then you go back and watch that actor in like Jeeves and Wooster or something, portraying a very different character.
yes, by the way, that dig at bad acting was certainly not at Hugh Laurie or House in general, but there have been other medical dramas that I was not a fan of.
Story's amazing.
Yes, exactly. Okay, before
Anatomy.
I wasn't naming names. Okay. Before we move on to genetics.
Hey, if they paid us, we would advertise for them.
Yeah, we would. No, we have no scruples. No. All right. But
we are very money motivated. You hear that, you guys? If you need us to advertise, just let us know.
Product placement, we're there.
Okay. All right. Before we move on to genetics, which we're going to cover
Carl,
briefly.
before we move on, I just need to crack open this ice cold Pepsi. It's really refreshing.
All right, Tim. All right. We tried this before, Tim, and we failed miserably.
Try.
Okay. We have updating on our user base. We did hit 10,000 downloads in a month for the first time ever. So we're doing quite well. So thank you to our audience. Still not anyone from the Yukon Territory. So I'm pretty sure it's because I said their names wrong. I think I said Yukonites. And I thought about it after.
Very offensive.
It's got to be Yukonians, right? That would make the most sense. I'm not entirely sure that's right either, but it sounds better.
I thought it was the
Yukon-
Yukon Golds, but I think that's actually a potato.
Yeah. So we need we've got to hit on those guys. We still have we're being shut out of the Yukon Territory. It's like
But
they
I think plenty of russets listen to us though, so I think we're good.
we're doing quite well in Idaho, so I think you're right. Okay. Moving on. So back to what you were talking about. There's all these different chemical and physical processes and structures in the cells that are doing a variety of complicated things. However, these things, like you said, some of these are like just chemical properties of the molecules involved, but somehow these things are all organized, right? Obviously, that's what a cell is, right? It's a big organization of different, what do you call them? Cellular, whatever. Anyway, smaller
organelles.
parts. Organelles. That's what I was going
Yeah.
for. Thank you. So how does that structure come about? What is it that structures a cell?
Yeah, so the basic things in a cell. So first of all, you need a place for everything to be. Okay, so that's all held in by a cell membrane. Okay, but other kingdoms have different. They also have a cell wall, which is just a thicker thing outside the cell membrane. Like it's kind of like your head compared to mine. My head's more like a cell membrane, and your head is like more like a cell wall. So that's why you don't have to wear a helmet when you ride your bike, and I do.
That's what they told me. That's what
but on a more serious side, so you have that contains everything inside the cell. And then you have these different organelles within the cell that have specific functions. Okay. So one of the main things that you need to know about is the nucleus. So the nucleus is like you could say it's the brain of the cell. So this holds your DNA. This holds the blueprint for every single protein, every single protein that you make in your body is housed in the nucleus. And every cell in your body has all the information that all the other cells do. The only thing that makes a certain cell a specific type of cell is which proteins it makes. And basically, if you think about it like blueprints, the cell is going to make whatever blueprints are open. So in certain types of cells, some drawers are locked and you can't use those blueprints. And in other cells, they're open and you do make those. And it will change the way the cell presents itself. So you may have an immune cell. You may have a liver cell. You can have a kidney cell. You can have a specific type of cell within the kidney because there's a bunch of different cells in there. You can have a neuron. You could have a muscle cell. And all these cells have the exact same genetic information. Every single cell in your whole body has the exact same genetic information. So once you have the genetic information, you got to have a way to organize all the blueprints that are coming out of the cell to help make these different types of machinery, proteins, building blocks, different types of things. So you have something called the Golgi apparatus. You have ribosomes. You have the mitochondria. You have, in like plant cells, you have different types of organelles that will help in photosynthesis. So there's all these different types of organelles that interact with each other that have specific things that they do. And it's pretty, when you think about like the amount of material that's contained within the nucleus, it's amazing that it's even organized in the first place, specific to each cell. And it's also amazing that you can even make the protein that you want and put it like into the cell membrane if you need to, or you can package it and excrete it out into the body. Like for, let's take like insulin, for example. Like your cells in your pancreas, they make insulin, and then when they get a signal from the body that that the sugar is high, they secrete that insulin, and that insulin will send a signal to the other cells of the body that say it's time to eat some sugar. So then they take the sugar into the cells, which makes the sugar lower in the body, and it turns off that signal. Like that, it's just amazing that all can happen through these tiny chemical interactions. And then you see things like diabetes where that process goes wrong, and it's it's terrible. It's a terrible disease, and it's lifelong, and it's frustrating. And we try to create these man-made means of these like glucose monitors that check your glucose all the time, and we try to make these pumps that will help you pump your insulin to try to keep your blood sugar contained. And it doesn't matter what we do, it's not as good as the real thing. Just the real thing is so sensitive and so good at what it does. Like the normal person, the layman per se, doesn't have to ever worry about their blood sugar. And that's just absolutely insane if you think about all the things that have to happen just to have your blood sugar to have your blood sugar regulated. It's just crazy, all the things that go into it.
Can I take you back one time? So you said the same DNA exists in all cells in your body, is that right?
Yeah, it's the same exact DNA that's in every well, okay, it's not in every cell. There are exceptions, like red blood cells don't have a nucleus, but I mean, like,
okay, but like a neuron has the same DNA in it as a skin cell.
Exactly, yes.
So how do we get different cell functions then? If they all have those same blueprints, how does a skin cell know, let's be skin, versus a neuron, which is doing neurological things?
Yeah, so a lot of it goes into embryology, which is how everything like develops. And there's certain signals through specific genes that will turn on or off specific segments of DNA that code for specific proteins. So in a neuron, there may be, if there's all the DNA information there, but it may only be using, 1%. I actually have no idea what the percentages are, but this is just spouting off the top of my head. But it may only be using 1% of that information functions that it needs to do. And then another cell, like a skin cell, is using 1% of its genetic information in the nucleus, but it's a different 1%. So there's different expressions of the same material. So it would be like, have you ever read like those choose your own adventure books, like the Goosebumps? So it's there's a bunch of different stories contained in it, right? But it all depends on your perspective. So only certain things are being unlocked as you read it, right? So it's the same thing with the DNA. There's certain sections that are not being read, that are not being expressed, and therefore it's going to be a different type of cell, and it's going to have a different function.
Okay, is that really kind of similar to the idea that, like, if I have a sibling, we are almost genetic, we essentially are genetic copies of each other, right? We're both, the DNA maybe not being 100% similar, but very, very close, right?
Yeah, so this goes back to, we can talk a little bit about genetics when we get into this, but so in your DNA, you get half of your copies from your mom, and you get half of your copies from your dad. Okay. So you have 23 pairs of DNA. You get 23 from mom, and you get 23 from dad. Okay. And then in the cell, they basically pair up with each other, and they can code for similar things. So you're going to be very genetically similar to your siblings because mom is giving you half your genetic information and dad is giving you half of your genetic information. The problem is that it's not quite like you're not like a clone of each other. Your genetic material isn't exactly the same. Yet you may have the same, chromosome 1 as your brother from mom, but you might have a different one from dad because dad has one from mom and one from dad, from his dad. So it gets a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
I would say you're more genetically similar. But if we talked about, like, for example, identical twins,
Yeah.
they have the exact same genetic material. There are exceptions, like your immune cells, which we could actually talk about the if people are interested in that. Talking about the immune system sometime would be actually very interesting. But you actually genetically identical twins, so identical twins have the same genetic makeup except for in their immune system, because the immune system is set up through random mutation, which is kind of wacky. But it's like a very bizarre system, and it's very cool. But so everything in the twin, like their basic DNA structure is exactly the same, which is why they look the same. And a lot of times they act the same too.
Right.
Like I've seen twins that, like you literally can't tell them apart, and they do the exact same things. Like there were these two girls in my biology class, and literally they would study together. They would say the same things at the same time. It was like kind of creepy, actually. So I don't know. If there's any twins out there, I'm sorry, but you're creepy.
I'll shield my from this episode.
I was going to say, I know that we have some that might occasionally listen to the podcast because their dad's on it, but
Yeah.
They're a little young yet, but in a few years I'll be like, don't worry, girls. Well, and genetically identical, the identical twins are genetically identical, but don't even over the course of time, the expression of those genes can be different. Am I right? That
Yeah. So your genetic expression can change based on your environment. So if the environment's different, then the expression can change. But the basic genetic material is going to be the same. Like you're not going to have, you're not going to change well, I mean, there always is mutations happening, but you're not going to change your basic DNA to something else, but you may express one thing more than you would express something else, which can change the way certain things are. Like, for example, this is just a really simple example. If you had two twins and one of them never went in the sun and one of them went suntanning every single day, the one that goes suntanning every day is going to have darker skin. And that's because there's these cells in your body called melanocytes, and they're going to produce more melanin, which helps protect your skin from the sun rays. So if you're never in the sun, you don't need to spend that energy that it takes to make all that protein that causes the tan in your skin, because that would be wasted energy. So the person in the sun's going to have darker skin than the person that's never in the sun, but their DNA is still the same. They both still have that gene, or that part of their DNA that codes for the protein melanin that it's just expressed more in the person that has the tan. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. We just heard it here from a doctor and learned it from a layman. Tanning will help you lose weight.
That's right.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my medical license if I listen to this.
Oh boy, learning all kinds of unique information.
My name is Dr. Bob Smith. Bob.
Okay. I did have so one of the other things that I guess we could get into if we want to in this podcast, and maybe we'll just briefly. You talked about how your environment can potentially change how your genes are expressed, but you still have the same DNA. However, evolution over time does actually change DNA. So how does that work?
Yeah, so evolution, so when your cells are making copies of each other, they're not perfect. The machines make mistakes. You have other things that try to fix those mistakes, but some of them are going to slip through. Now, let's take one of my favorite examples, and I actually haven't ever confirmed this, but I think it's true, so I don't know. You can go look it up later if you want. But so one of my favorite examples is
X-Men.
Yes, X-Men.
Sorry.
No. But if that mutation helps the person that they're passing that genetic information to, so it helps their offspring survive better, then that offspring will be able to produce more of their offspring are going to survive better, and then their offspring are going to survive better. So that line ends up becoming a better survivor in the environment. And then eventually that gene is going, or whatever expression that is going to help them with survival enough that things have kind of shifted, if that makes sense, to further want that gene. So let's try to do it in an example. So the Eskimos, they live up in the North Pole or in Alaska.
Is this a play for the Yukon Territory again? Because I'm all for it.
It is. Yukon Gold. Listen up. So they have to deal with very cold things all the time, right? Like they're putting their hands in cold water. They're like hunting for whales and, ice chunks like floating in water, and their hands are going to get cold. Now, it turns out that when your hands get really cold, they don't work that well. I think we've all experienced that, unless you're Tim and have always lived in Arizona. Everyone gets cold hands. They don't work very well. You can also get frostbite on your hands if they get too cold. That can lead to infections. Infections can lead to death. So it turns out that if your hands get too cold and they die and get infected, that's bad for you. Okay, so that's not good for survival. So within the Eskimo community, at one point, there was a random mutation that helped, that adjusted the circulation within the fingers. Okay, so this probably happened slowly over time. But the circulation in the fingers of the Eskimos is different, that allows them to be able to handle cold water better than your average person. So if you just stuck like me or you up there with the Eskimos, we're not going to be able to do what they do with their hands in the cold water and things like that without getting severe frostbite, because their genes have shifted over time to allow their fingers to stay warmer because of the circulation. Okay, so that's an example of how things can evolve over time.
Okay, so that's why it takes a long time, as well as obviously you have to go through iterations of populations in order to see these genetic expressions actually become widespread.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about millions and billions of years. For us, we try to comprehend that, but we're not really able to. We say, well, we haven't really been able to see evolution in our lifetimes, and we have, but I guess a good example is how viruses evolve very quickly. So they have like a very small amount of genetic material compared to like a living thing like us. But they don't have machinery to fix the mistakes that they make in the genetic code, which allows them to, and they're making so many, like let's say they make 1,000 copies of a virus, and since there's so many mistakes made while they're copying things, maybe only 500 of those would cause infection, but maybe 25 of those cause the infection a lot better than those other ones. So those 25 are going to infect more people, and when they infect more people, you're going to get copies of that genetic material that in turn like can infect more people. So you see things like viruses, bacteria, things like this that have smaller amounts of DNA and have a lot of pressure on them to mutate and to change their genetic information. They actually mutate a lot faster than very complex systems like humans or other animals or plants and things like that.
With longer life cycles, right?
Yeah, exact. And the longer life cycle, yeah, that doesn't help either. Because if I want to pass on, genetic information I pass on, and let's say I have a child that, when I'm 25, and then my child has a child when they're 25, and they have a child when they're 25, like that's a lot of years being passed on when, a bacteria can divide in 20 minutes. So.
Yes. Okay, so I think we kind of got the idea with evolution at a very basic level. I think there are classes in evolution, so we could mention Darwin as the founder of the discoverer of evolution. But yeah, that's the idea, right? The change of populations over time through genetic and through natural selection. Now, I know one of the things that plays into that, and something you've already talked about, is the environment or like the ecosystem that particular organisms are in, right? So what is an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem?
Yeah. So one last thing about evolution. So you have to have a genetic change. That random genetic change has to be advantageous for you to survive, and that genetic change has to be passed on to the offspring in order for evolution to take place. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, an ecosystem, like this was honestly my favorite part of biology is like cells and how the cells divide and how you pass on genetic material, like all that stuff is really interesting to me. Ecosystems were not my strong point. But basically, like when you get a bunch of living things that all interact with each other, that's like an ecosystem. And I can look up like the exact definition.
That's good. Learn it from a layman.
Basically how things interact with each other. So
okay. And I'd imagine. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think just like you said, that with the example you gave with the Eskimos, I guess the more different factors you have, and obviously, especially if you're in contact with other living organisms, it's going to have an impact on the ways that obviously genes can manifest and in evolution and how things move forward. But there are lots of different ecosystems, right? So internally, I have my ecosystem inside my body, right, and I maintain like a homeostasis. And then ecosystem.
Yeah, I don't know if that would technically be
considered
an ecosystem, because ecosystems are organisms acting together, like like the desert would be like an ecosystem. Or
okay, so we're looking much bigger than what I was just saying, as far as like a single individual is inside. I guess I was thinking more microbiome, right? Different bacteria and things, but that's different.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I could see what you're saying there. Like an ecosystem for a bacteria could be like just your intestine, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. You're the doctor. The
So I would just say if we want to figure out really what we're supposed to talk about, we could just Google the order of classification of kingdom down to different things, because they have done that, but basically it goes from little to really big.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So an ecosystem is bigger than just like a person or a species. So it's how the species interact. So yeah, ecosystems are important in the way things will evolve, because if everything were in perfect balance all the time, then there wouldn't ever be a mutation that was advantageous. And if there were a mutation that was advantageous, okay, then it would cause one species to outcompete the other, which would make the other species have to evolve in order to survive. Okay, so the way things interact within an ecosystem can cause stress on other species that can be, I guess, ingredients for evolution to happen, or like we can see, studying ecosystems can be important because we can see how we interact with our environment, and we can realize, like, maybe building a huge, knocking down a whole forest and building, like a bunch of buildings there, like apartment buildings,
It's a bad idea.
like that changes how that part of the world interacts. It can change like how the animals interact. It can change the climate. It can change the organic matter that's being produced
Also,
by
if you touch
by trees and things like that.
and if you touch them long enough, you can feel their pain.
Yeah, but
Sorry.
you have to take your ponytail and take those purple things that are at the end of it and wrap it around the bush.
Is that okay? All right. Fern Gully reference. So
No, I just looked it up. There is an actual federal limit on Fern Gully references in a podcast.
is it less than one? Because it would seem appropriate.
So the max.
Okay.
So
Okay. All right.
I was actually referring to Avatar, but
Oh, okay.
Okay, then we're in the clear.
okay. All right. Yeah.
We might not want to use the term ecosystem as well,
What is
because
that?
refers just to land.
Oh, well, I think no. I mean, ecosystems are still, like Johnny was saying, like they're. I mean, they are a part of biology, and they're part of how things interact, and trees and water and weather and all the other parts of what affect living organisms.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an ecosystem is just a geographic area. So then it does include like the landscape, the weather, but also like the plants and animals and things like that. So it's all those things.
Ecology.
The
ecology.
study of ecosystems.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, from what I was reading before, as doing some research for the podcast, these are studied, and maybe Johnny could tell us, he was a biology major. You didn't, I imagine you touched on ecosystems in some of your classes, but it probably was not a focus of any of them.
Yeah, I did take an ecology class
you did?
that
Okay.
just focused on that, and crammed for the final, and I don't remember most of it.
So,
hey, I was going to say I took an ecology class too, but I thought it meant university classes online.
What?
Did it sink in?
Someone cue the crickets.
It's really funny. Ecology. It's like, never mind.
Okay, I think we got it, but I'm not entirely sure it was worth getting. But I do appreciate the effort. I will.
That was great, Tim. I think that's a great place to end.
I think so too. Walk off to silence.
Drop the mic, Tim.
Just,
But seriously, we're kicking you off the call.
All right. Well,
gonna go outside and enjoy good hand circulation in my own.
okay. All right. Well, I do think we'll probably wrap up around here. Johnny, any last words on biology? Any overall structure or something that you either want to just emphasize or touch on?
I don't think so. I think we covered some of the basics. I think that there's a lot of things we didn't cover. Like differences between plants and animals, and like there's so many things that we could go into. And you have to remember that people that get a bachelor's degree in biology are studying for 4 years, and to be able to, I would just say take what's interesting to you and just try to learn more about it. I know a lot of people like to say, in college they think that they're too good for Wikipedia, but turns out we all use it. So if you're interested in something that's actually a really good source of knowledge and things like that, like and to learn some of the basics about a variety of topics, like you don't have to go read a research paper to try to understand biology. You can read about how other people have tried to make it more meaningful to the people that want to learn more about it. So if you're interested in genetics, go learn more about it. If you're interested in ecosystems, that's great. I'm not. But go learn more about it. And if you're interested in how the body works, go learn more about that. I think that there's so many things within biology that can be interesting. You just have to find what's interesting to you, and that makes you want to dig a little deeper in it.
Absolutely. And one final thing, we had a comment from a user here a couple of weeks ago. A user, once again, that's me, the computer scientist, slipping into terminology. That's listener. We had a person that listens that asked us about how we got into.
Are we in the grid now?
We are in the matrix. Yes.
I was to grid, not matrix. Grid.
I don't know. Anyway, we had someone ask about.
Come on.
Okay. We had someone ask about how we got in the different areas that we work in and the different areas that we have specialized in. And I guess just on taking Johnny's point really quick at the end of the podcast, if there is any point in your life where you want to focus on something, you can, right? Now, if you want to be a doctor, Johnny had to go do a lot of things to become a doctor, right? There's a lot of steps for that. Tim wanted to be a teacher. There's like, what, half a step, Tim, to become a teacher? Like,
well, we don't call it steps. We
trips, maybe, fumbles.
They're called building blocks for teachers.
Right.
Or Legos.
But yeah, I mean, for example, computer science wasn't what I majored in, but it became the thing I was most interested in. And so to get into the field, I started reading about it, studying it. I took a class in it. I got a really basic job in computer science that didn't do a lot of computer science, but had a little bit in it. And then you just kind of move forward along those lines, because if you find something that you're interested in and move that forward, that's how you kind of move up the chain in I guess in the economy. So go back and listen to the basics of economics. But yeah, that's a good place to leave it, Johnny. Thank you for walking us through the basics of biology. We will be back again next week or 2
Carl,
weeks.
So sorry to cut you off in a very graceful ending thing, but I'm hijacking this for a redemption joke that I just looked up online. What happened to your report card when you barely passed your biology class? Biodegraded.
Oh my gosh. I wish you wouldn't have hijacked anything.
Okay, and then I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here for kicks and giggles. Darwin just had a better publicist. That's what I'm just going to say.
Darwin had a better publicist.
Darwin had a better publicist.
Oh, than the other guy?
Yep.
All right.
There were other guys.
That's actually true.
Hey, history's written by the winners. So, all right. We will. I apologize to everyone that had to listen to that joke. We will reprimand
Or listen
him
to us.
strongly. But please join us despite that, and we'll be back for our next podcast. See you then.